Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Corver. Today we are joined by Peter Ludlow. Peter Ludlow is Associate Researcher at the Center for Logic and Epistemology at UNICAMP. He published in a number of areas ranging from linguistics and the philosophy of language to topics concerning group knowledge, blockchain technology, virtual worlds, and hacktivism. His recent books include Interperspectival Content, Living Words, and the philosophy of generative linguistics. You can find the links to all these books in the description below. I hope you enjoyed this episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Professor Ludlow, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. So maybe before diving into it, could you maybe just give my audience a little bit of a context of your background? How did you get into philosophy? And then also, we're talking about Noam Chomsky today and more broadly, of course, a philosophy of generative linguistics. Like, how did you kind of get into, that work related to Noam Chomsky?
Sure. Let me explain it to you the fun way. So I was always interested in philosophy, but when I went to grad school in philosophy is where I encountered generative linguistics. And I was in philosophy in New York City at the time at Columbia University. This was 1979 I started. And at the time, there were these philosophers there like Jim Higginbotham, who were deep into linguistics, and there were linguists there that were kind of into philosophy. There's a guy named Robert May who was in linguistics at Columbia at the time, and he was very interested in philosophy. And I was like, what the hell is all this? What is going on? Why are these philosophers doing linguistics, and why are the linguists doing philosophy? And initially I was sort of like just distracted. So I was like, I'm just going to hang out downtown in New York City. This is a very distracting time to be in New York City. So, but at that time in New York City, there was a group down on the Lower East Side, a group of people, half of which were musicians doing what we called no wave music, as in no N-O wave. And the other half were independent filmmakers, except that the filmmakers were they were starting bands, and the people in the bands were making movies. And so it was this crazy kind of mixed up group where, I mean, the word I hate, but is the correct word here, is synergy, because you got this great synergy out of these like musicians going into filmmaking and filmmakers going into music. And I sort of got it at that point. That is, it's really when you're on the edge of the intersection of these two areas, or sort of jumping across your comfort zone into another area, that things start to happen. So at that point, I got more into linguistics, and then I applied to go to MIT as a visiting scholar, visiting student, while I was still working on my PhD. So I spent about a year and a half at MIT hanging out with linguists there, and I haven't turned back. But I mean, one of the interesting things, though, when I was at MIT, I went to the chair of the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy and said, I'm thinking about, like, instead of like, once I finish my PhD in philosophy, maybe I'll get one in linguistics. And his response, well, why you do that? You have a PhD, that just sort of tests your ass power, whether you can sit still and do something. If you want to do linguistics, learn linguistics. You don't need a PhD to do that. And so since then, that's informed my method, which is basically to just go ahead and try and learn about things that are interesting to me.
No, that's really amazing. And today, and then specifically the relationship with Chomsky, what was kind of your first encounter there? Of course, probably at MIT, I guess.
My first actual encounter with Chomsky went like this. So you make an appointment. It's like going to see a dermatologist or something, because it takes like a month to get to see him, nice. Unless you're one of his PhD students. So you make an appointment and then you go in. So I went in and I go, hi, my name is Peter Ludlow. He goes, yeah, I know who you are. And then I go, well, I'm working on my dissertation. He goes, what's it on? I go, well, X, Y, Z. He said, oh, that won't work.
That's interesting.
And so I thought, well, why? And then he gives me these reasons. The second time I went in to see him, I went in And I said, he goes, oh, hi, how's it going? I go, well, I'm having these problems. He goes, what are the problems? So I like listed these problems, X, Y, and Z. And he goes, no, those aren't problems. But he
Nice.
proceeded to say why they weren't problems. So if he forgets that he tells you something's a problem, if you come back, then he'll solve the problem for you. Yeah.
Mhm. Very interesting. That's amazing. And of course, like today, we're going to talk about your book, Philosophy of Generative Linguistics, which actually is interesting because I don't think there's many books out there that specifically talk about the philosophy of generative linguistics in kind of a book format. So it would be very interesting, your main motivation for like writing this specific book, maybe
Oh,
some of
yeah.
the main philosophical issues that you were, dealing with that kind of led you to this book.
Sure. In the 1980s, I taught at a series of summer schools in linguistics in Eastern Europe. So this was a very interesting time. So it started in 1993. So it was basically just after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And some friends of mine organized these linguistic schools for students in Eastern Europe. Like it would be on the cheap. So the first 3 years it was in somewhere in the Czech Republic, I forget where exactly, and then the next 2 years it was in Bulgaria. And so they asked me if I would teach some philosophy of linguistics, some foundational stuff, and I did. And so over the course of those 5 years of those classes in Eastern Europe, I had collected some lecture notes, and then they eventually evolved into the book.
Mm. That's very interesting. Or kind of moving into the book, I guess you start also in the beginning discussing a very important distinction that Chomsky draws between I language and E language, competence and performance. So maybe can you maybe just explain a little bit what the main motivations and arguments are for kind of establishing this sort of firm distinction that some people are having difficulty accepting. So yeah, it would be great if you could
Sure,
maybe discuss that.
sure. Um, okay, so first of all, there's a kind of mistaken understanding of what I language and E language are, and the mistaken understanding, I think, is the idea that you're actually talking about languages in some sense. But it's really more about an approach to language or how you ought to come at language than it is about certain conceptions of languages per se.
Mhm.
So let's start with um, the I language, E language distinction. So I language can be reduced to three things, all with the letter I. So there is a notion of individualism, individual. The second one is intentional. And the third one would be internal. Okay. So by individual, I mean, or individual is maybe not even the best word. I have a better I word. It would be idiolect. So that when we're coming at language and studying it, the interesting thing is not the German language, whatever that is, and the English language, whatever that is, but rather idiolects. Why is it that Peter Ludlow came to have the kind of language or the idiolect that he did? What are the properties of my mind brain that allowed that to happen? And presumably that's some sort of shared mechanism that I share with you, that I share with everybody who's listening to this podcast. And if we understood that mechanism and we understood what those people were exposed to, we would understand why they had settled on the idiolect that they did. So that's the first I. I'm going to forget the order of these. I think the second one I mentioned was intentional. Now, this is the word intentional spelled with an S, not with a T, okay? So it's not intentional like I intended that or I intend something. But when you have intentional with an S, the best way to understand that is by contrasting it with the word extensional. So let me explain. Let's say we have a set. Let's say I have a set of red objects. So, here's an apple, here's a cherry, here's a brick. Here's a fire engine. These are all red things. The extension of that set is just the list of those things. It's just those things, okay? But the intention is the kind of recipe or formula that got you to those objects. So what was the recipe that I used to collect those objects, right? Okay. So when Chomsky is talking about language being intentional or talking about language being intentional, what he's saying is you don't want to approach language like people used to when Chomsky was a grad student and say there's a big corpora of data. Is that sentence written down somewhere in Google space or something like that? No, that's not the interesting question. The interesting question is, what was the recipe that led to those things being produced as sentences, or that led to us understanding those things as being sentences? Okay, so that was the intentional one. And then the third one is the internalism point. And this is going to be contrasted with external. So it's internal in the following sense, that when we study the human language faculty, or even when we study human language, the interesting action is going to be, in Chomsky's view, inside the head. It's going to be, these are internal properties of individuals, and it's not, in his view, things like spoken words or written stuff or so forth. The action is the internal action. So I language then involves that individual stuff, my idiolectal stuff. It involves the intentional stuff, what's the recipe, and it involves the internalism stuff. E-language then, on the other hand, would involve being extensional. We're interested in those things out there, maybe a corpora or something like that. We're interested in something that is external, that is outside the head, those sounds, et cetera, that people make. And I guess a third way would be that it would be anti-idiolectal. So it would be more about our shared, some sort of shared thing, as opposed to how I ended up with the idiolect that I end up with.
Mhm. And you then go on also make your own distinction, right, between E language, I language, and then you add phi language. Could you maybe
You have the wrong Greek letter. It's
oh
psi language. So
psi? Oh, sorry.
as in psychology, that's the
Ah,
idea. Because so what I did in my book, I wanted to make the case that basically I'm on board with the project about three. I'm on board with two of those three I's. Okay, I'm good with the intentionalism. I'm good with the idiolect stuff. But what I didn't like was the internalism. And so what I wanted to make was the case that there's a view about psychology that's been developed by people like Tyler Burge, in which you don't want to be an internalist about cognitive psychology. That is, when you're doing psychology, you're studying in part relational states, relations between us and our environment. So when I intend something or wish for something, that is a relation between me and my external environment. So then it was still a branch of psychology. That is, in my view, it's still a branch of cognitive psychology, but it's psychology understood in a certain way as potentially being understood externalistically, hence psy-language. Still down with cognitive psychology, but we're just getting rid of one of the three I's.
That's very interesting, and I think we can unpack that later in more detail. I mean, maybe
Sure.
as a sort of first try, I guess, like what would be, a sort of again, I don't know if this can be summarized quite easily, but like what would be kind of, Chomsky's hesitation as kind of a first sort of proposal, like why he would be maybe kind of rejecting sort of that more externalistic approach, I guess, to psychology.
That is like a core belief of his, and I don't entirely get it. We'll probably, I think you're going to want to talk about some of his arguments
Yep.
against referential semantics
Yep.
and so forth, but these are all of the same class of worries that he has. And, even at that time at MIT, when cognitive science started with, an AI with people like Minsky, the original versions of Jerry Fodor's work, the Katz and Fodor stuff, all of that stuff was very internalistic because they were thinking about things in terms of how do computers work. Well, a computer does what it does independently of what's going on in the outside world. That was the theory, right?
Yep.
So the computationalism played a role in it because the thought was that if you do computer science, you're just worried about what's going on inside the box. And there was a kind of Cartesianism that I obviously Chomsky found very attractive. I mean, even one of his books was called Cartesian Linguistics. So there is this kind of Cartesianism, which meets computationalism, and so it led to this very firm embrace of internalism. And with Chomsky, he holds on to a position until you prove him wrong. I mean, he doesn't think, oh yeah, well, maybe I'll change my mind. So he has his arguments for why you want to hang on to internalism, and until you really come up with some good arguments against him, he's going to stick with that position.
Mm-hmm. But it is interesting because I'm sometimes thinking, and I always wonder, like when I try to find in the literature, for example, like this competence performance sort of distinction, if that could be more of sort of a broader philosophy of science sort of methodology applied to different fields. But in some sense, if I understand you correctly, you can still keep this competence and performance distinction, very clearly, while still opening up the debate between internalism and externalism for kind of psychology. Is that kind of
Yes, you
right?
would see, if you're an externalist, as I guess I am, or at least as I defended, you still believe in the competence performance distinction. Because let's talk about the competence performance distinction for just a minute. I mean, that would be a case where, I have a certain linguistic competence, let's say, but then I break down. I stutter, I have a memory lapse, there might be processing difficulties. So there are all sorts of reasons why what I actually produce or write down might not be consistent with the language, or sorry, let's put it this way, with the grammar that I have. So we talked about a recipe
Yep.
for creating a set of objects. Well, here's this set of objects, but it doesn't really square up with the recipe, as it were.
Yep.
Well, why is that? And there could be lots and lots of reasons. So you have to understand that here is the system, but there are other factors that are impinging on it and creating noise is basically the deal. So you can still embrace this competence performance distinction and still be externalist about things if you wish.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So, and I'm just drilling down on that a little bit more, trying to understand that. So, in some sense, like if I understand it like that, how you just explained it, like this competence performance also just grounds a little bit some form of like idealization that you accept within sort of a scientific discipline. Would that be one way of putting it, or you think that's not really capturing it in its entirety?
It could be understood as an idealization, but it could also be understood in the following way, that there is a very concrete, non-ideal language faculty with a set of rules. And what you produce is not consistent with that set of rules. Okay.
Yep.
Well, why is that? Well, then we get into other issues. It's memory lapses, distractions, noise, physical impediments, and so forth. So there's also, if there's this sort of internal, let's say there's an internal grammar, and that's like an actual object, right? Not an idealization.
Yep.
There are lots of ways things can misfire, right? So as the expression goes, there's many a slip between twixt cup and lip, right? So just because your grammar is sort of settling on this form as correct, it doesn't mean that ends up being what gets produced.
No, that's very interesting. And kind of moving on, also when I was talking to Chomsky on the show, I also mentioned this point, but I'm curious what you have to say about this. So, I mentioned philosophers usually make this distinction between like the knowing how, knowing that dichotomy, also in epistemology. And then, in Chomsky's sense, like knowledge of language doesn't seem to fit in, either of those categories. So I said, what does that mean for the project of epistemology more broadly? And he thinks then, of course, like the project of epistemology, that accepts that distinction is kind of into the wrong path, I guess. And you argue in your book actually in that term knowledge is kind of just not a happy term used in the theory of competence for Chomsky. And sometimes it's true. Chomsky also talks about like cognizing, and then he talks about the Neo-Platonists, the British Neo-Platonists, kind of trying to ground also cognoscative powers. I think that probably relates to like cognizing cognizing more broadly. And in the end, you make the claim, let's just say that we have grammatical rules. So can you maybe just run us through some of that controversy regarding that word knowledge, and then also how you ultimately kind of settle and argue for, having grammatical rules as opposed to cognizing or knowing grammatical rules?
Yeah. The first time I saw Chomsky give a talk, I was still at Columbia, and he came to Columbia. This must have been 1979, 1980, or something like that. And he gave this lecture about knowledge of linguistic rules. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what are you talking about, Chomsky? Because look, I mean, when we talk about knowledge, I mean, normally we talk about it's true justified belief, right? So we don't believe these rules. No one believes these linguistic rules. We don't even know what they are yet, right? So it's like, why are you calling it knowledge? Well, I mean, he wanted to talk about some sort of tacit knowledge. So I talked about the little algorithm or something, or the grammatical rules. So he wanted to say at the time that there is a sense of know by virtue of which you knew those rules. It would have to be a form of tacit knowledge. But even that, the sort of true justified belief, I mean, even the word justified is sort of weird there, because, I mean, in what sense are those rules justified? You have the rules that you have, it wasn't clear to me what justified meant. It's not even clear to me exactly what true meant, because it's not like the rules are true in any sense. So at that point, initially, I just thought he's like 0 for 3 on this, because linguistic rules are not true, they're not justified, and you don't believe them. Why are you calling it knowledge? And he moved off of talk of knowledge and started talking about cognizing rules. But I thought that there was something right about using the term knowledge. There was something he was getting at. And when he's moved to cognize, I think he got to a notion that was too thin to do the work that he wanted it to do. Now, I think let's take cognize. One way of taking cognize is just to say, well, there are these linguistic rules that are represented. Let's say they're hard-coded, like lines of computer code that are hard-coded into your brain. I say, well, okay, that's what linguistic rules are. When I say you cognize them, I mean that they are just like that. Mm-hmm. But then, I mean, there was something he was getting at when he was talking about knowledge. And it is related to the whole competence performance thing, in the sense that, well, okay, so there are these rules that are hard-coded, but there's also this sense in which, you can understand that something is correct or not correct, even though you produce something else, right? And so the proposal I came up when talking about having linguistic rules, I wanted to tell a story in which those rules are not simply represented like lines of code, and then they're just part of a machine that cranks away.
Yep.
But they actually have a kind of normative pull for us. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, linguists will never say this, Chomsky will never say this, because they hate the word normative. They hate it. They just freak out. I've known many linguists, they hate that word more than anything, because when they hear normative, they think, well, now you're talking about prescriptive, like how language should be actually spoken, that you shouldn't dangle prepositions in English, and you shouldn't split infinitives in English. Just made up rules, right? But when I talk about normative, I mean individual norms. That is, that the idiolect of Peter Ludlow has certain rules, and they're not merely representative, but they play a role for me. And that role is that I take these to be rules for me, right? These are rules for me. Mm-hmm. And if something, say I'm planning a sentence, for example, or I am judging whether or not a sentence of mine is correct, or whether it's the correct thing to say, those rules are playing this kind of role where they set off an alarm bell for me, right? Yep. they sort of, there's a kind of signal like, that's not quite right. I don't know what that rule is, but it's playing this role in there that's setting off an alarm, and it's telling me I ought not to say it that way, or I ought to say it this way. So I wanted to say that what Chomsky should have said, and probably never will say, what he should have said was something like that. Because then you could get what you wanted by talking about knowledge in the first place, which gave it a kind of normative flavor, right?
Yep.
This is my rule for my language. It's going to guide me, right, in my use of language, let's say. And so it provides that, and it gets without all the baggage of knowledge. So it's a notion that's thicker than just cognizing, and it's appropriately thinner than knowledge is.
That's very interesting. And focusing, I have something that comes to mind, like when you know, take on board a little bit of that normativity, right? Like that starts to appear, like then
Yeah.
kind of mapping that back onto what you started with, right? Like, you know, justified true belief, right? Like,
Yeah.
are we then, you know, how much are we capturing still of that? Are we then capturing in some sense, like, you know, the justified or the true, because it's actually, you know, true in the sense that it is grounded, you know, those rules do exist. So like, how much do you still get of those, you know, three components of justified true belief? Are we still missing out on that completely? Or do you think some of that starts to appear in the more classical sense?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe you can reconstruct it.
Yeah, because
it's a job for a good Kantian. Maybe maybe it's a good project for you. Maybe you can reconstruct those notions then. Yeah, I haven't thought about that.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Again, I mean, just as a first thought, it seems to be at least that you can maybe give substance to the notion of true, in the sense that if, you know, the best theory says that, you know, it are those rules indeed that provides those normative constraints, then, you know, you're grounding truth in something. But I don't know if it's in the classical sense of like how people usually use it in sort of a in like epistemology, I
It's
guess.
not in the classical sense, but it's
Yeah.
an interesting thought. Yeah. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Let's continue thinking about that. But yeah, we'll unpack this also later in the conversation, specifically talking about that. But maybe building a little bit more of the framework, how to think about this. You know, you also discuss the different levels of explanation that we're working with in a theory of grammar, and like, you know, making sure that we are making those distinctions between these different levels and not kind of conflating maybe you know, certain levels with one another. So I would love to hear if you could maybe run us through some of these levels of explanation that generative linguists are interested in, and how we should understand that.
Okay. Again, this is not necessarily going to be something that a generative linguist would assent to or agree with, but I think it is a good way of unpacking the program. And what my ideas about this are influenced by earlier work by Alex George, who's a philosopher of language, and well, let me forget about what came from him and now what I'm adding, and I'll just give you the story. Okay. So let's make a distinction between a grammar, which is an abstract object. Okay, it's in Plato's heaven or something. Okay, then there's a what we could call a psy-grammar for psychology. So we have a psy-grammar, which would involve the instantiation of that in your psychology. Then a kind of level below that would be, let's say, your biophysical grammar. So what's underlying the psychology that you have? Well, okay, with certain facts about human biology, let's say. So there's the abstract level, which is a grammar, understood as an abstract object in Plato's heaven. Then there's a psi-grammar, which is the psychological state you're in by virtue of which you have that abstract object as your grammar, right? Yep. So I understand that this is perhaps a funny way of talking for some people, because I'm talking about a psychological state by virtue of which you have an abstract object. So at some point you're going to have to figure out what that relation comes to. I mean, I can say a little bit about it, but it's a little going to be open-ended. And then underneath that psi level, we have the biophysical level. Yep. So when I look at the Chomskyan generative linguistics, or generative linguistics more generally, when I think about the psy-language, I'm thinking about the government binding theory model, where roughly the idea is that there is this black box that you're studying, and it's got certain switches on it. When you're exposed to linguistic data, the switches get flipped in certain ways as though they're parameters, and that ends up setting the idiolect that you end up having. Okay, so that's the GB picture. That's my picture of the psi language. And then I believe that when Chomsky starts doing things in the minimalist program and talks about these very minimal operations like merge and notions like recursion, now he's getting down to the level of biophysical,
Mhm.
the biophysical level,
Yeah.
exploring it at a certain level of abstraction.
Mhm, mhm. No, that's really helpful. And uh, so one follow-up question on that would be, of course, when you talk about these different levels, indeed, the question always becomes, right, unification, right? But
Mhm.
do you think that that is, less of a problem in the sense that we're already working with, similar assumptions, at least when we talk about, both of those levels? So I remember one conversation I have had, for example, in this show with David Poupel, like a neuroscientist, and he was saying, from neuroscience and then linguistics, let's, take both of these primitives and then let's start, figuring out what the relationship is between the two. That might be from, completely different sort of frameworks, or, different sort of research programs. One of the advantages, it seems to me at least, but correct me if I'm wrong, from working within sort of a Chomskyan framework, is that when you talk about these different levels and you're trying to indeed hypothesize, how you might approach them, there's, maybe easier to make those sort of links because you're still working within sort of a similar research program. Do you see that as well, or do you still think that those people are running in similar sort of problems, or there have to be sacrifices within different levels of explanation?
Um, this is probably a better question for my daughter because she's a student at NYU and it's like working on neurolinguistics
Mm-hmm.
with Popel and those people. But the basic idea, I think, is this, that, we have these two sciences or branches of science, and they're not going to dovetail immediately, just like the unification of chemistry and physics didn't line up immediately, or biology and chemistry didn't line up immediately. So, but ultimately, the idea is to unify these two things. And I take the unification, sorry, not the unification, I take the minimalist program project to be Chomsky's effort to do a kind of preparation of generative linguistics to facilitate that unification. Okay,
I see.
by basically coming up with certain properties that should find expression at the biophysical level.
Yep.
Right? So we're not there yet, and I can't even tell you when we will be there. But gradually, you see these things kind of starting to line up so that they can dovetail.
Mhm. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Kind of moving to one of my favorite topics, actually, and chapters in your book. The chapter is called Data, Intuitions, and Judgments. So I really like this chapter. And let's start off by saying, certain critics, they kind of critique the generative enterprise sort of approach, and especially one source of data that is being used, and namely so-called linguistic intuitions. And then they also talk about the Cartesian intuitions, and also involving some inner voice of competence, giving them special access to certain facts. So can you maybe explain, what are we talking about here, like linguistic intuitions, how they're usually used, and then of course we can move on to your approach of countering some of these arguments.
Yeah, I hate the word linguistic intuitions, and I feel like part of, Michael Devitt has been on a propaganda campaign claiming that linguists are all about these intuitions and little Cartesian voices in their heads and so forth. And I think what we need to do is just scrap the word intuition and just talk about judgments. Because once you start talking about judgments, then it makes things a lot more clear. So
Mhm.
let's step away from linguistics for just a second and
Yep.
suppose we talk about chemistry or something.
Mhm.
And let's say we have a chemistry lab and I have a fluid in a cylinder, and I'm supposed to say at what level the fluid is in the cylinder.
Mhm.
Okay. And I'm going to, we don't say, what is your intuition about where the fluid is,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Right. I judge where it is. I'm going to judge using perceptual abilities or whatever. and some faculty of judgment in not in the Kantian sense, but in the ordinary sense. I have some faculty of judgment that I deploy that tells me where the fluid is in the graduated cylinder.
Yep.
Well, that's the source of my data, that judgment. Okay. Likewise, I can make lots of judgments about sentences of English. You know, radio, airplane, cigarette, lamp, was. Not a sentence of English. That's a judgment. I don't have a little inner voice in my head or anything like that that's telling me that. Or even in more complicated cases, like who did you hear the boy that Bill hit? Right? That's not English. Who did you hear the boy that Bill hit? But I mean, I know what it would mean if it meant something. It would mean who is such that you heard that Bill hit that boy, right? Semantically, it makes perfect sense, but we understand that syntactically it's just out. That isn't some voice of competence. That's just a judgment that I make that this sentence is wrong. And hence it becomes a piece of data about my language. And that data is going to play a role in the construction of the theory of grammar and a broader theory of language for me.
And for me, it kind of seems to argue then sort of for like just a pluralistic approach, I guess, to, you know, accepting different forms of data, right? And, you know, you do say, of course, those judgments can be wrong, but, you know, that's not an argument for not using it, right?
See, yeah. The philosopher Timothy Williamson has been on a campaign against intuitions in philosophy more generally. And he thinks that the reason people like to think of it in terms of intuitions is it provides them a certain kind of Cartesian safety net, meaning, oh, I can't be wrong about my intuitions, right?
Yep.
And so, especially in philosophy, because you're supposed to butt yourself against error. And so you try and get away from any chance you could be wrong. But he's pointing out, you know, it's better just to say I have a judgment that this is the case. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Sometimes we're wrong. There's less excuse for linguists to not move to judgment as opposed to intuitions, because, I mean, you're doing science. Sometimes you judge incorrectly. People make mistakes in experiments all the time. They, you know, people can even misjudge fluids in graduated cylinders. You know, they read the meniscus wrong or something. So there's all kinds of error. Live with it, you know. So what happens, and what has happened, is that a lot of people begin, because they want to insulate themselves against the possibility of error with these judgments, so they start thinking in terms of linguistics as just being a theory of the intuitions that I have. So I have these linguistic intuitions. That's what I'm studying. Some philosophers have actually articulated precisely that view. Okay, the view that that's what linguists are doing. And if you get in discussions, meta discussions with linguists on Facebook, a lot of linguists will say that too. I am studying these intuitions that we have. But I mean, back in the 70s, Chomsky was very clear about that. No, that's not what we're studying. We're not interested in this faculty of that you have for forming linguistic judgments. I mean, that is an interesting thing to study, right? I mean, that is, you could say, well, geez, that's sort of interesting. How is it that I can perceive and judge things to be acceptable, right? Likewise, we could say it's really interesting, you know, how it is that I can judge the level of a fluid in a graduated cylinder. That's a fascinating topic, but it's not part of chemistry per se. Right? Now, that's to say it'll never intersect with chemistry, because you might say, well, why are we having so many errors in our lab work? And then you hire some psychologist to study it, and then maybe you can build protections against those kinds of errors. And likewise, we could investigate this as part of the methodology of linguistics. We could say, well, you know, why are our judgments misfiring so often? And then we study the psychology of how we form those judgments, and then we can perhaps improve our methodology in that way. But when we get into error is when we think that that judging ability, or that, let's call it the judging ability, becomes the object of study. That's not it. That is simply a source of your data, right? Like the many other sources of data you have.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that that's really important. And you know, so besides, you know, moving away from talking about linguistic intuitions and, you know, moving towards linguistic judgments, I still think you're, you know, even emphasizing that point more clearly when you say linguistic judgments as scientific experiments, because then it's really being grounded in a much broader view of how do we do science. You know, let's discuss, you know, when do we accept certain sources of data in science. And, you know, we're not just talking about linguistics anymore. Indeed, now we're talking about, you know, you want to talk about linguistics, you want to talk about biology, chemistry, right? Like we're putting it on an equal footing and really raising the question, you know, is it so strange that we're accepting this source of data? Why so? You know, we need to have a strong argument why, you know, we don't accept that source of data, or start discriminating, right? So I think that's you know, also a very important step that you make. Maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on that.
Sure. In my view, the judgments are just experiments. You are running an experiment. Let's say, I want to know, can I move a WH word out of a sentence and a noun phrase in one jump? Who did you hear the story that Bill hit?
Yep.
Well, I just ran an experiment there. I said, well, let's set it up and let's see if I judge that as being acceptable or not. And so sometimes we get this idea that there's something wrong with this as a source of data, but, you know, it just happens to be a form of scientific experiment that is inexpensive.
Yeah.
The other thing is that it's like any other scientific experiment, it's replicable, because you know, you can repeat it. Everyone who's watching this podcast can sit down and say, oh, is that replicable? And then they can judge for themselves. So this idea that intuitions can't be, you know, they're not replicable or whatever. And it's also false that they're not public. Now, most scientific experiments are not done in public anyway, but we can do these in public. You can watch me do these kinds of judgments, you know. You know, and you can actually see me do things wrong when I form these judgments. So like I might say, well, you know, you can't in English, you have to raise a WH word, like who did Bill see? And then someone says, yeah, but you can say Bill saw who, which you can do, right? But then when I observe someone conducting the experiment like that, I see right away that they're putting stress on the who. That's critical. And then I can also see that, or I can ask them, you know, are they interpreting that as an echo question? Like when I say John saw who, that normally follows when I didn't hear what the word was, or I didn't believe that, you know, John saw Fred or something. Okay, so these things are replicable. Yep. They're public. They're also inexpensive, right? So here's the thing with scientific experiments. You want to get as far as you can, as cheaply as you can. There's a cost to scientific experiments. Sometimes we spend billions of dollars in scientific experiments like the Large Hadron Collider and so forth. But that's because there are these questions we can only get at by creating a super collider. Yep. A lot of questions we can answer very cheaply, very inexpensively, and linguistic judgments are one source of that kind of data.
So if I understand it correctly, or at least it seems to me maybe there is this sort of bias indeed, you know, towards, you know, gathering this type of data, I guess, because, you know, when we look at physics, or, you know, they're doing experiments in a very different way, therefore kind of, you know, creating a bias towards only that sort of source of data, right? Like that it also might create some bias in that way. I'm not sure if you think that is the case, but that kind of comes potentially to mind.
People often favor different sources of data, right? And I think the correct approach is that all data should be admissible. And so then there's a question for you, individual researchers, given the question that you are interested in, what is the data that would be most helpful? Can I get that data at minimal cost? Is it worth the cost to get the data, right? So there's always a kind of economic decision, right? Can if I need that kind of data, can I ever complete my dissertation or something like that?
Yeah, yeah,
So the prima facie position should be that any data is potentially acceptable.
yeah,
Um, and then and then we should conduct experiments to seek new data based on their promise, the interest or value of the questions we're investigating, and the difficulty of creating those experiments.
mhm. And kind of on a related topic, I guess you also have a very nuanced discussion. I feel like on a big theory versus big data, although you don't necessarily phrase it that way, where you go deeper into this sort of discussion. Where one of the claims you make is also that data is never theory free.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important point. So maybe you can say a little bit about that, and then also, I guess, the bigger debate, between data versus theory that is kind of showing up in all sorts of sciences.
Sure. Data is not theory free. So there are people who seem to be of the opinion that there's certain classes of data that are privileged because uh, it is atheoretical, right?
Yep.
So the idea is, let's just go bottom up. Instead of messing with all the linguistic theory, which maybe colors the way we approach the world, we're going to go at this in an atheoretical way, and we're just going to go out and observe linguistic data. And that's an illusion. The problem is that there is no theory neutral position, or not even theory, there is no atheoretical position from which you can view language.
Yep.
So as I pointed out in the book, even things like morphemes and phonemes, word boundaries, right? Those are important scientific discoveries, and they're part of the scientific theory of language,
Yep.
right? Levi-Strauss thought that the phoneme and the morpheme were among the most important scientific discoveries of the West, right? Up there with Newton's discovery of gravity, right? Whether that's true, I can't say, but I can say that they are important discoveries, and that they are in the background of these judgments that you're making that you think to be theory neutral. And
Yep.
so the problem is that when people come at this, at linguistics, whatever, and they say, oh, I'm coming at this in a theory neutral, atheoretical way, there's no theory coloring what I do, that's the worst position of all, because then you have this background theory, and you've like, it's become so sedimented in you that you don't even see it anymore, and
Yep.
it's not even challengeable anymore, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just like, and so it's coloring your data, and you can't even see that your theory is doing that.
Mhm.
So to me, that's the word. So to me, true, our theories do color what we say, but the most pernicious and the most dangerous position is the one in which you think you have that theory neutral or atheoretical position from which you can somehow see the world correctly. No, that position doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you think it does, you're mistaken.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I think it's very important, and I think also, but I don't recall exactly what the quote was. But you do also quote, I think Darwin on this point, right? Like when he says, like, there is no theory-free data. I'm not sure if you remember that quote. I remember that I really liked it.
Yeah, this is where Darwin talks about going to a gravel pit, right? And you could just go to a gravel pit and just like describe every rock
Yeah.
that you pick up,
Yeah.
right? All day, every day. And then, you could describe one rock every day, because rock is like infinitely variegated, and has different colors and textures. So you could spend all day describing one rock. And so you're in a gravel pit, where are you getting with that? Well, you're getting nowhere. The interesting thing is that Darwin wrote that in a letter to somebody, and he never said it. He never came out with this in public. And see, the thing is that Darwin had to face this problem too, which was that there was a kind of methodological view about how naturalism should proceed, which is that it should proceed bottom up in an atheoretical way.
Yep.
And they were like heavyweights behind that. I mean, let's be real. I mean, they were like people like like Bacon and Mill had both kind of advocated this bottom-up approach
Yep.
to methodology. And but Darwin understood that he wasn't proceeding in that way. He was
Mm.
proceeding in a kind of top-down way. Because if theory is not guiding what you're doing, then you don't even know what to look for. There are no interesting questions at that point.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that one of the he kept the origin of the species locked up in a desk for 10 years before it was finally published. And the received view is that he did that because he thought, well, I can't have this anti-religion element out there because I'll get crucified for being anti-religious.
Yep.
But I think the deeper problem was probably that he was rejecting the kind of heroes of scientific methodology of that era, and he was rejecting the bottom up methodology for one that was more guided by a top down methodology. I think that was his greater fear than the fear of the blowback he would get by rejecting creationism.
I see. And actually, one topic which is a little bit of a side topic, but I do think it's very interesting that you mention. When people say, okay, the data should lead, the theory, right, not the other way around. At one point, you also talk about, and it's still connected, but a little bit of a side topic, I guess. The idea of having some speculation in your scientific framework. You say that you talk about this boldness and having some speculation in there is kind of pushing science forward. Actually, I don't remember if this was actually from your book or from another article that you wrote, but I'm not sure if you have anything
I can't
to
remember.
say.
Yeah, I've talked about it in a couple places, and this I will say that I become annoyed at these people constantly complaining about Chomsky pushing the boundaries out there, and they're wringing their hands because too many linguists are following him out there. But you need leading figures to lead these kinds of speculative enterprises.
Yeah.
Sometimes they fail. I mean, that's what happens. These kinds of enterprises fail. But it's a good thing when a leading figure can do that and can bring a number of people along with them. So it's not just one person out there, but maybe it's a research program. It's good to have these kinds of research programs. I mean, Einstein had his little speculative research program with the grand unification theory, and that, I mean, who knows? That could turn out to be correct. So I think these kinds of very speculative kinds of efforts are great. Are great. I think it's great that Chomsky is not sitting there, rehashing what he was doing in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but he's out there pushing the limits still.
No, I'm fully on board with that. One last thing that I want to discuss with regards to data versus theory sort of discussion is on the topic of AI NLP. That's also a big discussion, I guess, where Chomsky has a decently firm position against certain approaches in AI. Could you maybe just share your perspective on that? Maybe how it relates to some of the things we've been discussing so far, and where you stand kind of on that discussion.
Yeah, my first job was actually in natural language processing. So after I got out of grad school, I went to work at Honeywell and their Intelligent Interface Systems group, and my first project was actually on machine translation. And I get why Chomsky doesn't really care about natural language processing, because I think he considers that to be an engineering project. But one of the very first projects I was involved with at Honeywell is they wanted to do a natural language interface for something, and I had I was working with this Russian computer programmer, and she had constructed this attempt to write the interface in natural language for the natural language interface, for an English interface for the thing. And it was like long and a mess. And so I took what she did and I just like wrote like a grammar for it, like on for the fragment of English that she was looking at, I like wrote a one-page
Mhm.
grammar for it, basically just using what I had picked up in linguistics, right? So even back then, it had application.
Mhm.
It was not the most interesting application, but if you want to apply linguistic theory to natural language processing, you can. Now, what's happening with a lot of natural language processing lately over the past couple of decades has been it's been involved with statistical natural language processing, which has not involved a lot of theory for the most part. But I think people are discovering that you can only get so far with the statistical natural language processing. And if you really want to impress someone with your natural language processing system, you're going to have to start folding these grammatical rules and principles back into it. Because, I don't know about you, but I've never really had that much success communicating with these telephone robot operators and so forth. And I think, I mean, I don't know. I mean, sometimes the engineering never really needs to pay attention to the science at all.
Yep.
Take like flight or aviation. I mean, we don't have to study birds to build airplanes, right? And we don't have to study humans to build AI systems. But the question is, are you interested in how humans do it, or are you interested in how it's done, right? Are you
Yeah.
interested in how birds fly, or are you interested in making a machine that can fly? And
Yeah.
those are often two different projects. And I do think that the theoretical linguistics um, and computational linguistics can inform each other still to this day.
Mhm.
And I think that in the fullness of time, they will become reintegrated again, like they
Mhm.
were back, in the 70s,
Mhm.
70s, 80s.
That's really fascinating. Kind of moving away from this entire discussion, going back to the topic of normativity. So, you discuss, okay, after we go through the discussion of linguistic judgments, you make the case that linguistic theories are not just theories that like basically focus on kind of axiomatizing linguistic judgments, but rather that they are judgments of our evidence of linguistic facts, and that our linguistic theories are designed to play a role in the explanation of these linguistic facts. So that's kind of what we discussed. And then you go on to kind of discuss this idea of normativity, so being normatively guided as an agent by individual linguistic norms. Maybe now we can go a little bit deeper into, why we should argue for this sort of normativity, and then indeed, your general point that many linguists are hesitant to talk about this notion of
Yeah.
normativity.
Well, yeah, let's first of all remind ourselves why linguists hate it, right? Because
Yeah.
it sort of sounds like prescriptivism,
Yeah.
right? What are the norms of my, and they think, well, it's like the French Academy telling you how to say something.
Yeah.
But so keep in mind, we're talking about individual norms. Now, the inspiration for my work on this was actually some work in ethics, initially by a philosopher named Nomi Pali,
Mhm.
and she's at Brown University, and then developed by Peter Railton, who you may know. He's a kind of Kantian ethicist that's at Michigan, University of Michigan. Here's the example from ethics. There's a story by Mark Twain about Huck Finn, and he's on the Mississippi River with an escaped slave named Jim. So it's Huck and Jim on the Mississippi River. And Huck encounters some guys along the way. This is in the South before the Civil War. And they go, well, is that some slave that's with you there? And Huck says, no. But Huck thinks that he's like being a bad kid when he says that, right? Because he's been raised that Jim is the property of the slave owner. He's been raised to think that you're supposed to turn in the slave. And so, but then the way Huck describes it is like, I know I'm a bad kid. I'm going to burn in hell for this, but it just didn't sit right with me, right? There was something that told him it just didn't feel right. So what's going on in there? Why is that case interesting? Because what Arpali and Railton are arguing is that there is this kind of tacit rule that Huck has and that he represents, but he doesn't have knowledge of it, right? Sorry, he doesn't have explicit knowledge of it. It's just tacitly there, and it does play some regulating role in his behavior, right? He doesn't know why. It just creates this kind of feeling, right? So it's like a Railton describes it as like a set point operator in engineering. Like, say you've got a thermometer and it hits a certain point and it sort of triggers an alarm or something like that, right? So there's this rule that's governing Huck. It hits this certain point where he's supposed to turn in Jim. An alarm goes off. He doesn't know why. It just doesn't set right with him. Well, similarly, I think you could say the same thing about linguistics. When I am uh, planning a sentence, say as I'm going through it, do I want to add a pronoun here or not? How do I proceed? There is often this sense we have that this is the correct way, this is not the correct way. And so the idea is that there's this kind of individual norm that each of us has, right? We have these individual norms that are guiding uh, us in our linguistic production, certainly in our judgment of what's the correct thing or not to say. So then there's this kind of judgment of what's correct or not, and then that's the competence level, coming back to that. And then there's the question of how you're going to perform on that, whether you're going to utter it that way or
Mhm. And actually that reminds me also, I guess, right? Like, I mean, there's also some work being done, on the notion of moral competence, for example, right? But there, people are much more welcome, of course, for this notion of normativity, which plays a huge role, I guess, in a lot of sort of moral philosophy. But
yeah. Yeah.
in some sense, I think it's interesting because. When you kind of make this claim, indeed, it's like a kind of a part of your ideolect, and you kind of grounding normativity in just, in some sense, cognitive science, right? And then in these different faculties that they all bring kind of their normativity with them. And I guess, you would have that in maybe sort of a moral faculty, a language faculty, right? But even maybe, a faculty of judgment, I guess, they all bring their sort of normative force with them. And now we're not discriminating between different faculties. In some sense, every faculty that we have, all the cognitive faculties that we have a normative force, right? And
Yeah.
we're not, but usually people, accept this. I mean, as far as I understand, like in the moral case, people do accept that. Where does this normativity come from? Is then the question,
Yeah.
right? But it's not like,
Yeah.
oh, is there normativity? So,
Yeah.
and some people might still say, no, it is, normativity, but they come in different ways, right? Like that might still be the case. But as far as I understand, you're really trying to make a claim. No, they're exactly the same types of normativity, and they spring exactly from the same thing, namely, basically, I mean, now I'm putting different words in there, but our human nature, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes. I think Chomsky actually believes that too. I mean, he
yeah,
believes there's a faculty of morality and
mhm,
it's part of our cognitive psychology. And I'm sure he doesn't believe that it's just a descriptive project, right?
mhm, yeah,
I'm sure he doesn't believe, how could Chomsky believe that, right?
yeah, mhm, mhm,
Well, if you can do that in the normative case and have the kind of normative guidance, right, in a kind of rule-based system as part of your cognitive psychology, then certainly you can do it in the linguistic case as well.
yeah. No, I think it's very fascinating. I like, yeah. So I think that's indeed when, as soon as you accept that, I mean, at least we need to have some arguments why there it wouldn't count. And in some sense, also, when I was talking to Chomsky about normativity in the case of morality, I guess, he also mentioned something that I thought was interesting, which was like, okay, at one point, we find maybe, those moral rules or whatever, right? And then you can, keep asking yourself the question, but why are they the right ones, right? And there we just have
Sure.
to stop, right? Because then, we might just not find answers for that, and we might not, find some independent sort of confirmation of those rules. And here it seems to indeed have the same sort of type of conversation, that as soon as you accept that picture, okay, they're not some independent moral reality where you can find those facts, and you
Not
do
an
say,
external, not an external. It's a very Kantian picture in a sense,
mhm,
because I'm the legislator for the morality for me. Yeah.
mhm, mhm,
Um, um, in the sense that I have these hard-coded moral rules that are set point regulators for me in my behavior.
mhm, mhm,
Right?
mhm. Yeah, no, I think it's a interesting picture. So as far as you are aware, there's not a lot of literature on that is trying to investigate, right? Okay, now we're talking still about a different sort of normativity in the sense of it's not just these prescriptive rules, right? That linguists don't want to talk about, but you don't know any research
Linguists,
that.
I don't know any linguists that are pursuing that.
Hmm.
No, I have, to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever written a paper talking about that part of my book,
Hmm.
right?
Interesting.
Not a linguist, as far as I know. I might be wrong, but I've never come across it.
That's interesting. No, and then a future project for
No,
some people.
really,
Yeah, yeah.
linguists are just completely allergic to the word
Mhm.
normativity.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. Although actually, when I was talking to Chomsky regarding normativity on like a sort of more broad sense, like especially when we talk about, which is actually, I guess, the final part of your book, when you also talk about the notion of simplicity, right? Like when I asked him, right, when we talk about normativity and we talk about notions such as even unity or simplicity, right, as sort of broad methodological notions, then he is also fully on board with that notion of normativity. And then the explanation for that is
Yes,
they are mind imposed. So there you have something similar again, that the mind
yeah.
does impose normativity. So again, it seems to be that there's some acceptance.
Simplicity is certainly a normative notion, yeah, or aesthetic. All these aesthetic judgments you make about a theory, they're mind imposed, but they're normative, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he, in my opinion, he's in this tenuous position if he wants to say that cognizing a rule is just like a line of code there.
Mhm.
You need it to you need to give that rule a role to play in a normative system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and,
Uh,
and
but he, I mean, I wish I could have a sit down with him to sort of grind through this stuff. That would
mm,
be interesting. It'd be helpful. But yeah, I do think that he he can't. This might be one of those places, these rare places where he hasn't completely staked out his position. But
mm,
I can't believe that he wants to stake out a position in which, you know, there's just a line of code there and it plays some sort of causal role. No, it's got to have some sort of normative claim.
maybe I'm now going to say something stupid, but basically one thought is also that comes to mind is that normativity only manifests itself when it is actually performed, so to speak. That when it is in the performance, kind of the actualization expressed in the world, that then this sort of normativity manifests itself. So that it's tricky to kind of pinpoint if it's where you want to put normativity. Is it sort of in the performance sort of component, right, when it's manifested and expressed in the world, versus, or you think that's all confusion?
It doesn't sound very. I thought you would did your master's degree on Kant.
Yeah.
so so I would think that the Kantian would want to say, well, this is sort of like, think of the normative as being part of the competence system and not the performance system. So you don't
Mm,
really need to wait to see how, I mean, because like Huck Finn could have said, should I turn in Jim? Yeah, I will, or something. He could have, the performance could have gone either way, but that normative sense he had about what was the thing to do, that was the normative component. And
mhm.
so it is sort of, it's at least analogous to the competence performance distinction, I think, in that like you can unhook your moral sense from your actions, right?
Mm, yeah.
Your moral sense could never ever, you could like bottle it up forever, or you could act, as like a great example from Kant, you could act in a quote unquote moral way your entire life, even though internally you're planning to screw people over at some point, right? So you
Mm,
could be morally defective even though your external actions, your performance is fine. So I think that the normative element of this is a kind of competence story, and then what you actually do is that's the performance story.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I do think actually like this competence performance might actually at least be a way to evaluate your position on sort of how
Right.
where you want to place it. Because so one thing I'm
Right.
thinking about in like the Kant literature, I guess, is also reason as sort of an end product versus reasoning as sort of a process, right? A process that is taking place, that is sort of
I
dialectical, right?
yeah,
So there
I
you
hear you.
could go. It's not that just that this product is there. It's fully in you in a sort of a Cartesian sense, and you don't have to do anything anymore. No, it's still kind of this dialectical, maybe even in some sense sort of a collective process, right? Like where kind of arguing, but then you have the question of kind of is this sort of dialectical component in actuality where this has to happen between agents through, for example, some sort of democratic process, or that sort of infrastructure that has to be in place, or is it sort of this modal sense of hypothetically could people, or is there the possibility that people would understand these sort of reasons, and do
Yeah.
these reasons have sort of this public character? And then especially this modal conception, I feel like then you're in between performance and competence, in the sense that there is this sort of innate sense to it indeed that provides these sort of normative constraints, but on the other hand there's also this sort of modal reasoning in trying to understand could this be accepted by a rational agent in XYZ
You might
circumstances.
find that the modal notion is too thin too. Like, so we'll talk about like a disposition. So one way of thinking about modals is thinking about them like dispositions,
Mm-hmm.
right? What would you have done or something like that? And the thought is, well, even dispositions are not good enough to get what we want. We need some sort of normative flavor on top of those dispositions or on top of those modal facts.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I would have done it because I'm motivated by some sort of rule, right? Not because I was like wired up to do it in a certain way. You see, even if you thought of, so let's take the linguistic case, for example. Like I could have like a linguistic rule just hard coded in me, and so I'm wired up so that I have a disposition to have a certain kind of linguistic behavior. Um, and that may or may not fail depending on certain things, but it isn't yet a kind of normative guidance going on there, right? It's just a hard-coded rule. There's some sort of disposition that falls out of that, but that's not to say I'm normatively guided by the rule. This is the sort of thing that sort of Kripke takes up in his discussion of Wittgenstein on rule following. So his book, To Follow a Rule, he basically says, well, like a dispositional story is not enough, right? Um, so what we need is that sort of extra secret ingredient that I was trying to get by talking about the set point operator, and the sense that something's not right, that you're not following.
Mm-hmm. No, that's interesting. So you already started talking about Kripke. So maybe we can move to another part of your book where you indeed talk about certain worries that have been raised about using rules and representations that of course have like its implications for generative linguistics. So maybe we can kind of go through some of these worries. So you start by talking about Quine and Quinean indeterminacy arguments. Maybe you can start with what those sort of arguments are about, and also kind of how Chomsky responds to those sort of arguments.
The Quinean indeterminacy arguments are things like, well, the data that you have, the linguistic data you have, are consistent with all kinds of possible grammars. And somehow this is supposed to be a problem, right? So no matter how much linguistic data you acquire, there's always still going to be an infinite number of grammars that could generate that set of data. And Chomsky points out correctly, I think, this is in his book, Rules and Representations, and other places, that that's just the classical problem of the underdetermination of theory by evidence. So every science, you have like a certain body of evidence, and then hypothetically, there are an infinite number of theories that could explain that data that is available to you. But the other thing he points out too is that, in practice, what happens is, we have this data, and far from having an infinite number of theories, we don't even have one. We're just trying to get one. Now, once you have one, then you can do something to generate an infinite number of theories that aren't really necessarily better. And then Chomsky points out that even if let's say you have like an infinite number of theories, you have more than zero, you have like one, you have an infinite number of theories that cover your data. Then he says, well, then after that, then you go into the best theory criteria. That's when you get into which one is better on grounds of simplicity, aesthetic elegance, which one is going to dovetail with other sciences better, right? So Chomsky was quite correct, I think, that there was no interesting difference between that grammar and the problem of the underdetermination of theory by evidence, and the standard problem of theorizing in science, the underdetermination of theory by data. And I think Quine even reversed his position on that. I remember sometime in the 1980s, he published a short piece in the Journal of Philosophy in which he walked that back. So he ended up saying, well, I still believe that the theory of meaning is underdetermined, but I don't believe this about grammars anymore.
Interesting. And kind of moving to another challenge that was raised against rules and representation that you mentioned, namely by a philosopher named Saul Kripke. So can you maybe run us through that argument? I mean, you refer to it, or maybe he refers to it. Actually, I'm not entirely aware of that, of this skeptical argument. If you could run us through that, that would be really helpful.
Sure. So the idea is to challenge the very notion of rule following itself. So he's borrowing this idea from Wittgenstein. And so the way it's set up is with this kind of classically philosopher's thought experiment, which doesn't have much, which sounds pretty crazy, but the idea is, well, suppose someone goes around adding things, 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 3 is 4. And then you get up to a certain number and you get up to adding something to 57. And then all of a sudden, you are, how do I know, right? When I was doing all that addition before, how do I know that the rule I was following before didn't just mean I was adding things coming to the normal rule, but I was really doing this operation called quaddition, which means when you get to a sum greater than 57, you return 9, for example. So 57 + 5 is 9. 57 + 2 is 9. 50 + 8 is 9. So let's say all that time in my life prior to getting up to 57, how do I know I wasn't doing that rule quad before? Now, obviously we say, well, that's kind of crazy, but the interesting question is, well, look, what is the fact about you that makes it the case that you were doing addition and not doing quaddition, right? That is the issue. And the idea is, well, there is no fact about, or Kripke's idea is that there's no fact about me in isolation that makes it true I was doing addition instead of quaddition. And if you want to find some sort of fact that's going to anchor that, then you're going to have to go into some sort of social realm and whether people take me to be engaged in this sort of social activity of addition rather than quaddition.
Okay, very interesting. And how does Chomsky respond to that? I guess, I know he puts it again in a broader context of science, but yeah, it would be great if you, summarize that.
Chomsky has actually changed his position on this and in a very interesting way. So when I was at MIT, this is when he lectured on this, and his lectures on this topic came out in this book called Knowledge of Language, and published by Prager Press, I think. And in that book and in those lectures, what he was arguing was that, well, wait, I can't tell you yet because I have to back up and explain something. All right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So to set up this problem, I have to get at the real heart of the Kripke problem for the cognitive scientists. So we've been talking about this rule that's sort of represented and that a person might follow or not follow, that it could be normative for me. And we talked about it as hard-coded. At this point, it doesn't really matter. It could just be it could even be non-normative. This objection should apply to any sort of rule in cognitive science. And so both Wittgenstein and Kripke raise this objection, which is, well, there's no even fact of the matter about the machine in isolation, about you in isolation, or about any machine in isolation, which makes it true that it's doing addition instead of quaddition. So, example, let's say you have an adding machine there, and you're adding things up, and it's 1 + 1 is 2, and 3 + 3 is 6, and 50 + 2 is 52, and I go, that's an adder. And then Wittgenstein and Kripke are standing there, they say, no, that's not an adder, that's a quadder, it's quadding. I go, that's crazy, because like, I go, look, open it up. I look at the gears and all this stuff and the wires, and then I say, look, you look at how that's gonna go, and it's gonna keep doing addition forever. And then I close up the machine, I add 50 + 8, like a gear slips, and it returns 9, right? And anytime I do this, there's a gear slippage and it returns 9. And I go, that's a malfunction. And then Wittgenstein and Kripke say, no, you can't call that a malfunction. You can't call it a malfunction until you know the intentions of the designer of the machine. Maybe the machine was designed to do this, right? So then they claim that there's no fact about the machine which makes it an adder instead of a quadder. So this is the point that applies to computers, not just to humans, right? So it would apply not just to cognitive science and rules in cognitive science, but it would apply in computer science as well. That whatever is grounding the code of a computer is not facts about what's going on inside of that Apple, right? Or that PC. That's crazy stuff. Okay, are you with me?
I'm with you. Yes. I
Okay,
have one
good.
comment in mind, but I will
Yeah,
leave it.
yeah. If you have a question, ask it, and then I'll get to the Chomsky response.
Yeah, one thought that comes to mind, which is how I would think about like responding, but probably this has been thought about and is wrong, but would be basically like this fact of the matter in some sense, right? Like might not be accessible in sort of like a metaphysical sense, because okay, this is the fact of the matter, but just because we're like sort of like constrained in all sorts of ways, but embedding that sort of claim within a scientific theory, right? Like that in some sense grounds the reality, probably at least of having that fact in that scope of that theory, but nonetheless that doesn't mean that maybe that theory has access to specifically explaining that fact, but it is embedded within just a broader theory of that fact could hypothetically be explained. Nonetheless, it's not in actuality that we can start explaining all those facts of the matter, but it fits within a broader sort of scientific claim, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, one of the things I did in my book was to show that this kind of thought experiment could be pumped to attack all kinds of scientific theorizing. So, example, crystallography, anything that has a kind of information theoretic structure to it, or any sort of structure to it is just here's a material. You can generate these Kripke, Wittgenstein objections to it. So one of the things you might say is, well, this is just going to be, you can raise this objection to any science, so who cares? At that point, we're no worse off than biology. Right? We're no worse off than mineralogy. Chomsky's initial thought was, well, no, I mean there is a fact of the matter about what the data structure of the machine is. But then there was one of these rare things where he moved off of that, and he took on this really interesting position, right? Which is actually, you guys, Kripke and Wittgenstein, okay, you guys are actually right about computers, that there is no fact of the matter, because that's an artifact. It is an artifact which is the product of human intentions. It is not the product of the natural order. It is not a natural object. But the human mind / brain, on the other hand, that is a natural object. It is not the product of human intentions, and therefore the objection doesn't apply to human beings. It doesn't apply to cognitive psychology. It only applies to our understanding of computers and what they do.
Very interesting. And I think in the book, but I don't completely recall, like, like what would be your response to that, right? Like what's your position? Like, do you think that that distinction, artifact and kind of living organism, or like part of the natural order, like can indeed be grounded and is a way to deal with it, or you still think we're dealing with some issues?
Well, okay, let's lay out the options that are available to us now. One thing you could say is computers and humans are the same thing, and neither of them have these rules, or there's no fact about matter about them in isolation. You can go the Chomsky route and say, well, computers, there's no fact of the matter about what they're doing, but that's because they're artifacts. But humans, that's a different story. There is a fact of the matter about humans. Or you could propose a third way in which you attempt to ground both computers and human cognitive psychology in a kind of different story about how these things are metaphysically grounded. And you say, well, it's not a fact about the thing in isolation, but rather that even the computational state of a computer depends upon the environment that it's embedded in. So there used to be this project maybe it still exists, at Stanford, at the Center for the Study of Language Information, called the Situated Engine Project. And it was, John Barwise was kind of a big player behind that. And there was a computer scientist named Brian Cantwell Smith who was behind this too. And their thought was that, computer science got into this whole Cartesianism mindset. And we were thinking that, whatever's going on in a computer has to depend on what's internal to the box, as it were. And that's not the correct way to think about it, because what the computer is doing is actually a function of that computer as embedded in a certain environment, given certain tasks, et cetera. So, even the syntactic states, as it were, depend upon that. So that's an idea, right? And in effect, that's the idea I end up pushing or trying to defend, which is, so look, I understand Chomsky's move here, right? But I can't make it work in my head. I can't figure out how it is you're going to make this distinction between artifacts and natural objects. I mean, that's what he needs, right? So all this rests on Chomsky being able to make a distinction between an artifact and a natural object. A natural object is like the human language faculty, a natural object is a computer. Mm-hmm. But I mean, what does that distinction even mean? So like, let's go into nature for a minute. I mean, are birds' nests natural objects, or are they artifacts? I mean, maybe birds think they're artifacts, but to us, they're a natural object. Likewise, a beaver's dam or a beehive. I mean, to us, they are natural objects. They are a natural product of these organisms and the part of the environment of those organisms, right? And so, say an alien came to Earth and began studying humans. I mean, would it consider adding machines to be weird artifacts, or would it consider adding machines to be natural objects in the same way that we consider birds' nests and beehives and beavers' dams to be natural objects? Mm-hmm. And so that whole distinction between that he wants to, where he makes his firewall there, really seems like shady to me. Mm-hmm. But I mean, he doesn't have a lot of moves at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Because he himself has convinced himself that there's no fact of the matter about what the computer is up to. And I know this guy, I was in a long email correspondence with him back in the 80s, in which, sorry, it wasn't email, it was like pen and paper correspondence. And I thought, well, if you get down to a low enough level, sure enough, you could ground the notion of a syntactic state of a computer, if you really grind way, way down. And I said, like, take just something like a simple switch, like a toggle switch, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like the simplest possible machine. And you could say, well, look, obviously there are two syntactic states, this one, this one. And then Chomsky said, well, no, that's not true, because some sort of alien might look at this and say, well, it's like a tester for finger strength, and pass a certain threshold, we don't care. So even take the simplest possible machine you can think of. So in a weird sort of, not in a weird way, in a totally weird way, Chomsky's the one that convinced me that you couldn't come up with a story about the syntactic state that a machine realizes in isolation, about the machine in isolation. You're going to have to come up with something more to anchor it, right? So then he has to draw a line, right? If he's going to hang on to his internalism, which we talked about earlier, right? He has to hang on to his internalism that the computational state that a human is. There is a factor about the human in isolation, because that's what internalism is all about. So what does he do? He has to draw a distinction between humans and the computer, and he does that with the artifact and natural object distinction. So I ended up going the other way, and so the only way this is going to work is if we figure out how it is that both computers and humans can be in computational states that are grounded not in what's going on inside the system, but that are grounded in how that system is embedded in the environment. So then that leads to a cascading effect of a bunch of really interesting questions about, you know, the environmental sensitivity of syntax, computer syntax, you know, like computer code. Like you say, well, it's a fact what this computer is doing. Well, it's a fact that's a function of the environment that it's embedded in, right? Yeah, so the basic idea is we just are, then is that you want to anchor this stuff, not just in what's going on inside the system internally, but in the external environment. And then that leads to the cascading effect that I alluded to earlier, which is going to like throw all kinds of things into reconsideration. For example, what is logical inference? Well, then it becomes it can't be completely internal, as it were, because even syntactic states are not completely internal. Logical inference has to be environmentally sensitive.
But that's very fascinating. Kind of maybe moving on to the topic of referential semantics. So, you know, Chomsky has been arguing against that for a long time. You specifically mentioned 3 objections, I think, in the book. So can you maybe just run us through, you know, what are some of his objections against referential semantics? And then we can go into why you do think there is a match between the I language and referential semantics, or at least the possibility.
Sure. All right, let's back up a little bit and forget everything we just said, because right now we're going to assume that Chomsky's absolutely right about the internalism, and let's suppose he's right about linguistics is a completely internalist enterprise that depends completely on what's going on inside a person's head. So that syntax is completely internal, right? Let's give him that. So we're just, everything I just said, I'll concede it to Chomsky. Now, what do you do about semantics? Because ordinarily you think of semantics as being about language-world relations. So even if the syntactic states are individualistic, you could still say that, well, the semantics, that's about language-world relations. That's about, you know, here is a syntactic representation of the word water. The semantics is going to tell me what it is out there in the external world that represents. So in Chomsky now, he's in this deal with semantics where when he'll talk about meaning representations, but it's a funny sense of representation because it's not actually a representation of something, right? Or if it is, it's a representation of some concept that's an internalist concept.
Yep.
Right? Now, this view is widely held. You know, philosophers in the 60s held this a lot. There's still people in cognitive science that believe this. Ray Jackendoff is a big proponent of this idea that whatever your theory of meaning is, it's got to have to do with what's going on inside your head. But other linguists, semanticists, many semanticists, not all, believe that you're involved in language-world connections. Chomsky has an arsenal of objections now against that sort of view about meaning and in particular reference, right? And what he doesn't like is his idea that what it gets you to is like when you look for something to hook up the meaning with the word with to be its meaning, if you're looking in the outside world, you're going to find crazy, crazy things that can't possibly serve as objects of scientific investigation, right? That's the basic thing. So the first one he has is what I would call the implausible commitments argument. So we say things like, I found 7 flaws in the argument. And then Chomsky says, well, do you really believe that, are you going to say there's really such a thing as flaws? Or something like, the average American family has 2.3 children. Oh, do you think there's such a thing as the average American family, right? So that's his first objection. Let's talk about that objection for a little bit.
Yep.
So now you've got it. You want to argue against Chomsky. There's one of two different directions you go. One is you say, Noam, like the things are more complicated than you're pretending here, and it's more complicated because what's happening is that's not really a referring expression when I say the average family has 2.3 children. What I'm saying something is like, on average, a family has 2.3 children. Mm-hmm. So it's like an adverbial thing. And so this is a line that Jim Higginbotham and Chasen Stanley have made, that you look more closely at the linguistics here, and it's going to tell you that there's something else going on, more than meets the eye. But that's a dangerous game to play against Chomsky because he is the best person at generating counterexamples of anyone in the world. And then you tell him it's like, on average, a child has 2.3 children, and he says, well, okay, what about this? Your report failed to make it clear that on average, an American family has 2.3 children, right? And he keeps generating these examples where it doesn't work. Or instead of saying, an average American family, suppose you say Joe Sixpack, which is a word for like the average guy, right? Joe Sixpack's family has 2.3 children. So what I argued was that you don't want to try and finesse the syntax to sort of absolve you of the commitment to things like the average family, but the average family is this kind of abstract object that was actually invented in like the 1820s or something like that by statisticians, and it's an actual theoretical posit, like atoms or quarks or something like that. So that was that. Now another objection he has is what we'll call I guess we could call it the type mismatch argument, which is that the kinds of things that you get internally don't line up with the things that you get externally. And so he has these examples like, well, water. All right. So I have a representation of water, and it includes lots of things that I call water, right? There's some stuff in this cup. Let's say it's water, but there's impurities, et cetera, et cetera. And Chomsky says, well, look, I mean, if you want to talk about water, what is water? Water is H2O, right? And you don't mean to say that the meaning lines up with that. Well, what does it line up with? And then you might say, well, it could be water plus impurities, right? But how many impurities? And then Chomsky points out that sometimes the impurities, it depends on where you are. So let's say I go to a restaurant and I order tea, right? And so that's water with impurities, like someone soaked some tea leaves in it, but it's just, we don't call it water. If I get that, I go, I didn't order tea, I ordered water, right? I send it back because I want water. I want different impurities in my water. But now instead of saying that like we're at the restaurant, let's say I'm just at home. I turn on the faucet in my house to get some water, and like the water comes out, but it's been someone in the water system put tea leaves in it. So now it has the same composition as the glass of tea that I got at the restaurant. In this case, I don't say tea, I call it water. I say this water is impure or something like that. So it's like Chomsky's point is that you can't even get you don't even want to like you know, it's not even enough to specify exactly how many impurities you can have, because that's not enough, because in different contexts, different sets of impurities are going to be relevant.
Mhm.
So that's why he doesn't like talking about the meaning of these things as being objects out there in the external world, because the objects in the external world that we call water or whatever, you know, never really, well, the objects the natural objects that are out there in the external world never really line up with our concepts of water, of tea, and things like that. Like, he thinks you can't cash them out in the external world.
Mhm.
That's
And
his deal.
I think, as far as I remember, in the book, you do say at one point you make the claim that he's not really having, you know, sort of an argument against referential semantics, but that it's more about isomorphism between. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my view, which is that he's really arguing against a view that sort of that the syntax and semantics should line up perfectly, or rather that, you know, your word representations and things in the world should, as sort of envisioned by science, should line up perfectly. I mean, they don't. So, but you know, that's just to say that when we talk about the meaning of a word and we talk about its expression in the external world, we're not talking about how science is going to divide up the world. Okay, we're not talking. We're almost never talking about H2O when we actually talk about water. We're talking about a different kind of stuff. And it's true that it's a very kind of weird, squishy, socially amorphous object. It has a very dynamic meaning, as I've expressed in another book. But that's okay, on my view, because we can still talk about those weird, squishy, dynamic objects being out there in the external world, right?
Yep.
They are the objects with which our semantic theory hooks up. Now, Chomsky doesn't like that, and part of this is there is a kind of old school 1950s edge to Chomsky here, which is that he kind of wants to say that, you know, the things that really bottom out as being real, I mean, whatever we mean by real here, but where things should really bottom out is how science carves up the world, right? And if you're really serious about language hooking up with the world, then you better tell me how it hooks up with the world as science carves it up.
I see.
And but as science carves it up before it worries about word meanings and so forth, as it's just worried about things like chemistry and physics and so forth.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember like your interview, like the Stony Brook interview, right? Like it comes up, it comes up in there where he responds to you by basically saying like, no, I mean, like it's not necessarily that I'm, saying science is the only way, but you know, what are you interested in? I'm interested in doing science, then I'm interested in this sort of stuff. That's his response there, right?
Yeah. There's a scientific way, and then there's the kind of I don't give a. In his view, you don't care. You don't care. You're not interested in serious questions way. Yeah.
Yeah, although actually, like it does come a little bit more complicated, right? When you're talking about, for example, understanding, right? Like when he says things like, "Oh yeah, you know, some of our understanding, you know, most likely will still come from, you know, books, novels, those sort of things, right?" Then there is a clear sense of still understanding that does come from different sources. But it maybe it really just comes down to, you know, what are we interested in?
He does allow that, but he's, you know, he wants a firewall to keep that out of the scientific enterprise. That stuff has to be out of the scientific enterprise. And he's had this idea going way back to, you know, his writing about Skinner and so forth. You know, a lot of this stuff that you're doing in behaviorism is deploying concepts that don't have place in a proper scientific study of anything.
Yeah, and you also go on to talk about, okay, you can reject sort of referential semantics, but what's the alternative? And you kind of go into that also a little bit. So what sort of directions are available? If you reject this referential semantics,
Yeah.
what sort of projects do you see?
Let me give you two. One project would be to say, well, all right, I'm not going to really worry about is what what things refer to out there, but we'll think about it rather in terms of semantics is charged with coming up with inferential relations between sentences or expressions or something like
Mhm.
that. So what all we're really interested in is how I infer from, um, you know, all men are mortal, John is a man, therefore John is mortal, that sort of stuff. And you say, well, I don't really need word meanings to do that. I could just come up with some sort of theory. I could have a syntactic theory that would do that by coming up with inference rules for what we could call a natural logic. Sometimes it's called natural logic, or
Mhm.
you could run your natural logic off of natural language expressions. I mean, people have played with this idea for quite some time,
Mhm.
going back to the 1970s. I'm working on a book right now with a linguist in Slovenia, in which we're developing this idea in mind-blowing detail. Okay, so you can pursue that idea. In that case, then word meanings really have to do with the role that the word plays in this sort of inferential system.
Mhm.
An alternative view, which I looked at in the book, is saying, well, suppose we went expressivist. So we get rid of true and false, and we replace it with expressivist predicates like yay. Instead of true, we say yay, and instead of false, we say boo. Yeah. And then we have to rebuild our logic, not using truth and falsity as the primitives, but we have to rebuild it using yay and nay as the primitives. It's not a trivial exercise. Um, and so then you construct a new, what we could call expressivist logic. Certain people have um, proposed this for ethics,
Mhm.
like Alan Gibbard has proposed an expressivist account for ethics. And their worry is always there was this sort of like concern that was raised by Peter Geach many years ago that, well, you can have an expressivist logic for your moral theory, but then when you try and plug it into the regular logic, things
Yeah.
blow up.
Mhm.
But here, what you could do is you just run that expressivism through the whole system
Mhm.
so that everything's expressivist. There is
Mhm.
no non-expressivist semantics. It's all just, there's no true false, there's just yay, nay.
Mhm. I see.
Um, I actually gave a paper on this at a conference on recursion because I wanted to build a recursive theory of the expressivist
Mhm.
stuff.
Mhm.
And Chomsky was there, and he liked that idea. He actually
Nice.
did. I was shocked. I was shocked. It's the first thing it's the second thing I've ever written that he liked. Because but the way he puts it is like, yeah, plausible.
Nice. Very interesting.
Yeah. So why does he like it? Because it's a way of doing semantics that frees you up from the referential
Yep.
semantics stuff.
Yep. Mhm.
And now you're embedding your theory of meaning into a kind of theory of attitudes,
Mhm.
which is
Yeah.
a part of our cognitive psychology, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So what you have is a kind of calculus of attitudes that are going to predict when you say yay and when you're going to say nay.
Mhm. Mhm.
Then what happens to the normative force? Well, then you read Alan Gibbard, and hopefully he explains to you why you're still being normative or something.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, that's great. Kind of maybe as a final question, focusing on the kind of the last chapter of your book, which is about simplicity
Okay.
and formal rigor. I think you mentioned. So, what's kind of maybe the main thesis of this book, and what is, of course, the relevance for kind of understanding or evaluating kind of linguistic theories?
That's interesting, because like Chomsky, I mentioned that there was one other thing that I had written that Chomsky likes,
Oh
and
yeah,
he
what?
loves the thing I wrote on formal rigor, because the point was that there's no pre-theoretical conception of what formal rigor is, and the only conception of rigor that's relevant is rigorous enough to make your position clear.
I see.
Right? He loves that, and then he hates what I said about simplicity, because what I argued was something very similar about simplicity. I said there's no pre-theoretical notion of simplicity, but the best notion of simplicity that we have is just a notion of simplicity that's a sense of simple for us to do, makes the theorizing easier for us to do, right?
Yep.
Now, that's a view that was held by Peirce and other individuals. But you want to broaden that a little bit and think about other versions of simplicity, which I also agree with. So Elliot Sober, who is a philosopher of natural science, argued that, well, one notion of simplicity is, are you helping the theory to line up to be integrated with the rest of science, as it were? That's a notion of simplicity too. Okay. Well, now, if we want to go there, then I'm in agreement. I think that there is a coherent notion of simplicity in linguistics that involves, are you adjusting the theory so that it's going to integrate with the rest of science more naturally and more easily? I think Chomsky harbors a sense of, when we do scientific theorizing, there's also a notion of best theory that involves elegance, possibly independent of whether that contributes to the integration of the theory with lower level science. So I said earlier that the minimalist program is like preparation for the integration of linguistic theory with low level biophysical principles.
Mm-hmm.
I think that even if that didn't work, right, Chomsky would still like the theory because of the aesthetic elegance that it has.
Mm-hmm.
So when he talks about Galilean science, sometimes, so Galileo kept insisting that the orbits of the planets were circular, and then you give this evidence, well, we kind of look elliptical. He's like, yeah, don't, I like circles, don't bother me with that. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how long Chomsky would cling to this, but he might just say, okay, so the integration with biophysics didn't work out. I still find this elegant, and that's the best theory criterion, and so we're going to roll with that.
And what about the thought that comes to mind when I remember also talking to him in the interview, and then it was about this notion of simplicity specifically, right, in the context of normativity, where he was referring to Goodman on the notion of, simplicity is in some sense, theory building and so, right, like, if you want to build a theory, there's no other way than to kind of use this notion of simplicity. So then it seems to be, again, I might be misconstruing a little bit in the details, but it seems to be almost that simplicity coincides into our notion of what a theory is. Like, do you have any thoughts on that?
If that's the case, then there's no disagreement between us, because then what he's saying is that, well, I'm going to construct my theory to help it to dovetail with other science, and it's going to be as efficient and effective as I can, and it's going to be the easiest theory I can construct that can do all this, that still dovetails with science. If that's what simplicity is, then there's no distance between us on simplicity.
Interesting.
I don't know. This is another case where we need the three of us sitting down to talk about this, because I would like to question him more about that, to see exactly where he stands on that.
No, that would be really fascinating. So, Professor Ludlow, I really appreciate your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. Do you have any parting words to the audience?
Absolutely none. Go about, have your day, stay safe, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much.